The wicker spread a black cloth on the ground beneath a tree with a large, drooping branch swollen with leaves. He took 4 stones from his pocket and spread them over the cloth. Then he grabbed the branch, shook it hard, and several leaves fell onto the cloth. Bending down, he tucked the cloth neatly into a makeshift sack, shook it, and reached inside. He pulled a leaf in one hand and a stone in the other, crushing them together. A brief, faint light came from his hands, as a bit of ash fell between his fingers. He opened his hands, and a stone with a rune engraved on it appeared. The seer first looked at Helga. "I can see her. She still lives. The one you seek. The one who cursed you. I see her. She stands forever on the white marble of Falagur. Find her there. Talk to her. For only the skald who cursed you might undo what should never have been." Kinnikin repeated the same ritual, this time looking at Asteria. Kinnikin's eyes widened as he spoke, and he looked past the group. "In this rune, I see a king handing a coin to a varang. I see the gleam of drawn swords. I see the blood of your family. You have lost much, families of families, left by a clan. In this rune, I see that fate has already brought you to this varang. He is here. But not only fate, but you are also guided by something, someone, an animal. Follow him." Once again, Kinnikin performed the same ritual and looked at Cullen. "A place I see," Kinnikin whispered. "A terrible place. A place that seems unreal. An old tower of black and gray wood. A witch's shrine. It rises on the winds and storms from nothing and returns to nothing. But within you will find a whisper of truth. Twice you shall walk these halls. You must." Finally his gaze landed on Siri. "My friend, it is good that you have returned. And I am afraid that my earlier guidance did not give you all the answers you sought. But perhaps it has brought you the companions you need to find your way home, and perhaps more." Kinnikin paused and continued to study the rune. "These new creatures, the ones on the banners of the hunters who attacked you. I see their bare teeth. I see them guarding what you have lost, the clan of the war. That is where you must go." Asteria, Siri, and Cullen allowed Kinnikin to engrave the runic symbol on their skin. It burned at first, but when they touched it, it looked as if it had been tattooed for many years. The old wicker added that everyone's fate was intertwined, and that they would need each other for the journey ahead. Herolf asked about his fate and the runes, but Kinnikin said that the 4 runes spoke and that there was nothing else in the visions. This news saddened Herolf and shook him. Sari did her best to cheer him up, and Kinnikin offered to drink with him. He handed out drinking horns, and they cheered together. Herolf felt a little uplifted. Everyone asked the seer questions, trying to understand the visions better. He told Sari that a group of war had visited Nowhere a few weeks ago. Herolf explained that they needed a ship, and Kinnikin recommended checking the docks. The Feast of the Serpent would be held 2 days later, and he recommended everyone to attend, perhaps challenging captains to wager their ships. The group asked about Sidi, and while the old seer was reluctant to share any information at first, he eventually let the group know that he had a vision and that the child was to be taken to the maw of hell, the underworld, and that she had a greater path in what was to come. The child was frightened by the news, and Sari promised to protect her. Asteria added that with her dagger training, she should be able to defend herself by then. Sidi looked at the dagger and felt a little more confident. Kinnikin reached out his hand to the child, who was frightened at first, but when he opened it, a small wicker kitten appeared, and Sidi gasped with joy as the cat jumped onto her shoulder. She petted him and called him Kotter. Seeing the wicker cat, the group could not help but mention the wicker rats they had encountered at Kekel Tower. Old Wicker was curious and explained that such work was extremely complex and must have been made by a master craftsman. Remembering items from the tower that they wanted to show the seer, Helga took the iron head from her bag to show him. He examined it with wonder, but was unable to provide any further information. When they showed him the green tome, however, he became very interested and offered to buy it to study. It seemed that he really wanted to use it. The group declined, thinking that it might be useful in the near future. Asteria asked again if he was sure that she was not cursed, and the old wicker confirmed that he had not seen anything like that in his visions. Asteria shook and laughed uncontrollably as she had a nervous breakdown. All this time, believing she was cursed and distancing herself from everyone. All for nothing. Meanwhile, Sari cheered Herolf up again and asked him to be her captain for the flagship they would acquire. She believed that he still had a role to play, and that they were counting on him to help them. Herolf nodded and added that it would be an honor to have a glorious death during Ragnarok. They thanked Kinnikin for his visions and answered their questions, and left. As they were leaving the grove, Kinnikin called out to Sari and asked to speak with her. Asteria looked different from her usual self, as if a great weight had been lifted after her conversations with the Seer. Helga took the opportunity to ask her why she thought she was cursed. Asteria started to open up, but withdrew after explaining that she would be more comfortable having this conversation over food and drink. She asked back about Helga's actual curse, but the old woman did not feel comfortable enough to elaborate. Sari rejoined them, and together they crossed the river with the help of a ferryman. Sari led the group to the most popular tavern in Nowhere, the Eye of the Storm, a long, narrow, two-story building that looked busy from the outside. Through the open windows, the group saw a variety of warriors and commoners sitting around the tables. Although the sweet smell of spilled mead filled the air, it barely masked the stench of overcooked fish. As they entered, they saw that the tavern was crowded with patrons. Tables were scattered throughout the lower level, most of them occupied. A wooden ladder in the back led to an upper level with several sleeping chambers. Elsewhere, the clatter of dice, shouts of joy, and barks of anger filled the air. A stout woman stood behind the counter, barking orders to a group of tired-looking staff. The group gave the tiefling coins so she could buy drinks and hot food for everyone. Siri went to the counter and spoke to Zelan, an older woman who was the tavern's bartender. The tiefling added a few extra coins and asked that they be well looked after. She also negotiated for 2 rooms for the night. She also asked about the recent visit of the War Clan, and after slipping in a few extra coins to get Zelan to cooperate, the barkeeper told her that she had seen sailors with a strange emblem she had never seen before exchanging goods for weapons. Sari would probably get more information from the blacksmith. After the conversation, Sari sat back with the others, and the meal was served. Despite the strong smell of unappetizing fish, the meal was actually delicious. Everyone ate to their heart's content, enjoying the warmth of the tavern and the food and drink after such a long time. Sidi wanted to join in and drink mead, but when Cullen let her take a sip from his drinking horn, Asteria prevented Sadie from drinking more and gave her a non-alcoholic drink instead. Sadie's cheeks turned red from a few sips of mead, and though they were amused, they made sure she would not drink more. The evening went on, and Harald finally suggested that they take an oath of fellowship. He raised his drinking horn and waited for the others. Cullen immediately raised his as well, and Helga thought for a moment before following them. Asteria looked down and said she thought she was destined to make this journey as a lone wolf because of the curse she thought she had. But now she felt she could be part of a group. She smiled and lifted her drinking horn. They looked at Siri, confused about what an oath of fellowship was, but she finally accepted it and they swore it together and drank. Later, when Asteria wanted to go back to the forest to look for the wolf, the young woman was about to stand up but was interrupted when suddenly the raucous laughter died down, as a thin man dressed in green emerged from the curtains behind the stage at the far end of the banquet hall. The man played with his hands, casting the shadows of a variety of creatures against the wall, some of them quite convincingly rendered. There were giants and serpents, and even large herds of horses and warriors clashing in battle. The audience laughed out loud each time the man appeared, frightened by his own creations, until he collapsed and rolled back into the curtains, leaving only his head behind. Everyone was amused, especially Sidi, who was genuinely impressed. Herolf explained to her that the show described the creation of the world by Grimnir, and told the story. Once there was a world, another world, that they called the Lost Lands. All knew the story of Mirgal and his folly. His vanity, deviousness, and longing for power doomed the Lost Lands. Mirgal brought about the end, yet Aldian, in her infinitely growing wisdom, understood how he might also become a beginning. As she conjured the magnificent rainbow portal, she pierced Mirgal again and again. Blood sprayed, covering her, the spear, and ultimately spilling into the void. That blood was transmogrified by the power of the portal, and it proliferated. There, on the other side, it simmered and bubbled, a vast sea of crimson. Her next strokes were precise, bits of flesh that twisted, coiled, and grew, wrapping around, twisting against, that sea of blood. The two, flesh and blood, land and sea, fought the first wars between them, struggling to find a balance. The largest chunk of flesh became the inner lands, smaller bits the other continents, and the smallest flesh pieces became the uncountable islands of the Serpent Sea. And yet, despite these gruesome wounds, Mirgal still lived. His lifelight dimmed in his eyes. She struck him again and again. His leg and arm bones became the great mountain range Turnfjall. Other bones became smaller mountain ranges, and his shattered teeth the numerous boulders dotting Grimnir. Her death stroke parted his head from his shoulders, and all his body was cast through, torn and shredded, and repurposed to become a living land to shelter those he had failed. Only his head did Aldian leave behind. For nothing could be gained, she reckoned, from bringing his cunning into this new world. After that, Asteria got up to leave the tavern, and the group offered to follow her and help her find whatever creature she was looking for. Herolf stayed in the tavern and went upstairs with Sidi, feeling that they could both use a warm bath. They briefly checked the nearby forest, but when Asteria found no tracks, she suggested they cross the river and head back to the forest they came from, where she had last seen him. Upon returning to the city, the group found a strange tree stump outside the city proper. It was different from the other trees in that its bark was very much the color of iron, though rain and wind had severely eroded the stump. Asteria touched it, and though it looked like wood, it felt cold, as if she were touching a metallic surface. She and Helga recognized the type of tree, explaining that they had heard stories about these iron heart trees. The old woman explained that it was said that the ironwood witches could speak and see everything from the trees, even walk through them. Cullen cut off a small piece and found that it was much harder to chop than a normal tree. They crossed the river, and as they walked down the streets, Asteria suddenly heard a howling sound. The others did not seem to hear it, but they followed the half-elf, who quickened her pace toward the source of the howling. Suddenly, from around a corner, Asteria recognized the creature's head. She approached it and it disappeared again. She discovered its tracks and showed them to the group. They eventually led to the dock, but she lost track of them. Asteria thought she would have to do this task alone. Helga and Sari returned to the tavern, and Cullen offered to stay at the dock in case he saw something. On their way back to the tavern, Sari asked Helga about the green tome. She admitted that Kinnikin had asked her to bring it so he could study it. The old woman was surprised that the tiefling would ask her privately and not with the others, but she gave the book to the tiefling and returned to the Eye of the Storm. As she went upstairs, she heard screaming from one of her rooms and saw Herolf trying to rub Sidi's back while the child tried to escape from the bath. Helga saw this and offered to take over and give the child a proper bath. Herolf nodded and went back downstairs for more drinks. When Sidi was clean, Helga put her to bed and went to Herolf to ask how he was feeling. He was still a little shaken by the news, but still determined to help them in their quest. During this time, they could not help but overhear a conversation among the sailors. They had heard rumors of a mystical spear stolen from the Well of Wisdom. As Asteria searched alone for the creature, she heard another howl and saw its tracks. Once again, they led directly to the docks, where Cullen was waiting with a stoic expression on his face. She asked if he had seen anything, but the young man shook his head. Asteria called it a day, and they returned to the tavern. Asteria was mentally exhausted from the recent events and went straight to bed. Later that night, Sari finally returned. She said that Kinnikan had tried to perform a protection ritual with the green tome, but it had failed. He gave it to Siri and explained how to perform the ritual. He hoped that she would be able to do it eventually. After that, Siri left the group to go to her own home. She entered her tent and found Benzo awake. He was happy to see his friend again, but saddened to hear of Gosler's death. They had an emotional catch-up, and Benzo kept coughing. The poor man was sick and could not adjust to Grimnir's weather. Sari said that she and the others would have to leave soon, but that she would visit again before that, as she left the tent.